Very good. So today we are going to talk about three figures. All three were very influential in they had a great influence on Kurdish politics, Kurdish religious nationalism, and they were contemporaries. So we start with Said Nursi. Now it's mostly known under the influence of Turkish nationalism or Turkish Islamist group. Usually he is referred to as Said Nursi. So Nurs would be the village in which he grew up. It's close to Bitlis, which is again close to Van. He used to refer to himself as Mala Said Kurdi. So Mala, we know, is a title for religious scholar in Kurdish, like Mullah in Persian. Today, we are mostly going to talk about Said Nursi's work in his pre-exile life and how he represents or illustrates another example of religious nationalism, especially in the Kurdish universe. There are a number of characteristics that make Said Nursi, beside being a very significant religious scholar and probably the most influential religious scholar in Turkey, 20th century Turkey. There are some other aspects of his life, thought, and work that makes him a very interesting figure. So Said Nursi's thought, which we are going to talk about and concentrate on, is mostly between 1910 and 1907 and 1925. We know that in Turkey, there were two constitutional revolutions. The first one took place in 1876, when for the first time in the entire Muslim world, a constitution was drafted, and constitutionalism officially was introduced to the Muslim world. This was very, very important in many ways. So there were various groups, figures, and interests involved in the drafting of the Constitution or in the constitutional draft. The major figure between drafting the Constitution was a person named Medhat Pasha, who had grown up, I think he was born in Palestine. I don't know whether he was a Turk or he was an Albanian, or I am not entirely sure. If Malik, you can tell us. But for whatever reason, I am not obsessed with him. So he was behind this major reform that took place in the late, let's say, 1870s. One of the aspects of the reform, so reform had two dimensions. One was the land reform, and the other side of it was supposedly Iskan Ashair, or settling the Bedouins and nomads or tribes. So what does this tell us is, again, tells us how the statesman during the Tanzimat era was thinking about state, society, people, and other things. And all these various attempts at modernization or modernizing the empire, both on the state, education, bureaucratic level, as well as the societal level. Although society is a word one has to be very cautious in using it even today, not to mention then, because it's in one way, again, is a mirror image of the nation state. But so Medhat Pasha certainly was one of the figures that genuinely believed in the constitutional form of governance. Unlike Abdul Hamid II, who came to power and replaced his brother in, again, the same year of the Constitution, when the Constitution was approved and drafted, he was mostly looking at it in terms of just he accepted the Constitution and the constitutionalism as an instrument of his accession to power. So this history is important because in some ways it helps to understand Said Nursi's or Said Kurdi's constitutionalism as well. So just after 6 months after his accession to power, Abdul Hamid pretty much made the constitution defunct and put it aside, and it was the constitution after that was not in effect until the second constitutional revolution, as it's described, that takes place in 1908, where is really the balance of power and pretty much a coup-like situation that took place that forced Abdul Hamid to accept or surrender to the constitutional demand. So usually in the Turkish literature or the Ottoman literature, this period of Abdul Hamid's rule is referred to as the period of istibdad, which is the Arabic word for tyranny. And it was a very common, in common use. And one of the Muslim revivalist figures who was ethnically Kurd and nationalistically Arab, Abdul Rahman al-Kawakibi from Syria, actually he's from the Haidari tribe of Kurds, wrote this major book influenced by an Italian thinker about istibdad. The book's name called Tabai' al-Istibdad wa Masari' al-Istib'ad. So the nature of tyranny and the struggle for domination or objectification or turning people to a slave. Istib'ad, sorry, not istib'ad. Istib'ad comes from the word abd, the slave. So, and you can see instances of Kawakibi's influence on people like Abdul Rahman and Said, people like Said Nursi. So Said Nursi, like, or Said Kurdi, like Sheikh Said, whom we are going to talk about a little later, and Sheikh Ubaidillah, these were all related to the Naqshbandi Sufi order. And in some way, they were also geographically close and connected. So they were mostly close to the Sarhad region, if you think about it. I mean, Sheikh Said would be a little bit closer to Diyarbakir, but anyways, geographically, they are not very far. One, Hakkari, and at the same time, we can also talk about the fact that Sheikh Ubaidullah had very much influenced Kurdish consciousness or affected Kurdish consciousness in terms of perceiving Kurds as a distinct nation, and at the same time making Kurdish elites, be they sheikhs, mullahs, malaz or ulamas, as well as even community leaders, big landowners, or if you might want to call them head of tribes, as well as lay intellectual thinking about this. And I have if anyone is interested, an article about these intellectuals, Kurdish intellectuals in Istanbul, who write about, actually they were writing about Kurdish identity and politics exactly when Sheikh Ubaidullah was preparing for his revolt, and at the same time they talk about Sheikh Ubaidullah and his influence. So, and
yes, if you can share that that article, that would be great. I'd be interested in learning more about that.
Very good, very good. So it was mostly based on articles that were published in the Ottoman papers, or the things that they have written, but of course I will share it. So this is one of the things that you can see, that Sheikh Ubaidullah's influence was not only affected Kurds, let's say, on both sides of the border of the Ottoman and the Qajar, and the Kurds in Syria, today's Syria and today's Iraq and today's Turkey were all part of the Ottoman subjects. And of course, the only remaining Kurdish parts would be the today's Iranian side. So anyways, his scope of influence was very, very much, it was vast. And at the same time, it had a lasting impact on the Kurdish nationalist thought. And so, and as if you read the chapter on Said Nursi there, I discuss various groups that were influenced by him, and despite the fact that he died, his son became a prominent figure in both Kurdish, probably the most prominent figure in Kurdish politics, and even in Turkish politics. He became the Speaker of Senate after 1909, and when Abdul Hamid was ousted of power. So this situation, and then Abdul Qadir had been one of the figures who had been kind of in not fighting physically, but he was politically against Abdul Hamid, and he was disseminating his ideas. He was connected with various Kurdish figures, and among them were people like Mullah Salim Afandi, again from the same town or the region where Mullah Saidi Kurdi himself, and actually they had a discussion once together, and there's some disagreement, but in 1914 Mullah Salim Afandi was executed by the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress. So, and there he says Mullah Salim, when he was executed, he says, you guys have occupied the entire world, let at least Kurdistan be for the Kurds, he tells the Turks. Anyways, so you see how the language of nationalism was developed and how distinctness of Kurdistan and even geographically, even in the paper that I talked about it, the Kurds try in one of the articles they wrote in 1880s, they try to actually to do two major things. One, they talk about a Kurdistan that existed almost for millennia. These are, whether factually accurate or not, are not important. We are talking about the discursive impact of this kind of perspectives and views about history. And then the other thing that they do there, they talk about the 16th century Kurdish Ottoman alliance that took place against the Safavids as a kind of coalition that it took place between two nations. So there is this idea about the Kurdish agency in history, and then they make an argument which was, it became very popular, and in various Kurdish journals like Jin, you find this argument that they say Ottomans are morally obliged to help the Kurds to create their own nation. Their alliances in history was at the time of empire and at the time of the empire, creating a state based on ethnicity or nationality, distinct state, distinct nation was not a common thing. But now we are living in the nation state era, and therefore it's very important that, not just important, Ottomans ethically and morally obliged to help the Kurds to create a state of their own. So Said Nursi and Sheikh Said and Simko Ismail Simko that we are talking about today are the product of this era, that in many ways, at least on the elite level in Kurdistan, Kurdish politics and Kurdish nationalism had been crystallized. And you could easily talk about the distinctness of Kurdish nation and the Kurdish right, Kurdish political right, which was a very important thing. And then another thing that takes place, of course, the issue of Ottomanism, constitutionalism. And from the perspective of people like Said Nursi or Mullah Said Kurdi, constitutionalism was pretty much like a modern way of conceptualizing democracy, not just as a form of limiting, not a form of governance that limits the king or monarch becomes a monarch's rules becomes conditional, which is even in the Arabic, Kurdish, Turkish, Persian version, usually they refer it as a mashruta, which comes from the word shart, Arabic, shart. So its rule is conditional based on certain condition that the king's rule, his rule, not its, his rule becomes legitimate. And this legitimacy is entirely based on whether he follows those conditions that are cited in the Constitution. So that's why in the Middle East region, usually the constitutionalism referred to as mashrutiyat or mashruta. So because it's for the first time the rule or the governing system becomes conditional. Its legitimacy is conditioned no longer as, okay, this guy is a son of other king, or this guy is Zillullah, or as Ghazali would have argued that as soon as someone is able to establish an order, this person is a legitimate king or ruler. So the only condition for the legitimacy of the rule from the perspective of someone like Al-Ghazali was establishing the order. So the very act of the establishing of the order would be the sufficient condition of the legitimacy of the rule. And then he is a ruler. Or from the perspective of someone like Al-Mawardi, the very declaration, the first declaration of, in addition to being a Qurayshi, if you belong to the Quraysh tribe, if you were the first person to declare yourself after the death of the caliph as the caliph, then it would be sufficient. And actually is an example. This just the way someone marries a woman. The first person who marries the woman is the rightful husband. So anyways, but constitutionalism is essentially understood as a conditionalism. So meaning you have a new chapter in the understanding of the governance in the entire Muslim world. No longer just inheriting or being or establishing the order would be sufficient, at least theoretically, to be considered as a ruler. So another aspect that would become a major thing or major characteristic or traits in Said Nursi's work is the fusion of religion and nationalism. So Said Nursi is one of these scholars that talks about two categories of nationalism. So nationalism can be positive, musbat, milliyetçilik, or negative. So it's not for someone like him that nationalism is against Islam, and Islam, there is nationalism in Islam, or there is not nationalism in Islam, or these things are very much later discussions that become popular after the rise of Islamism. So Said Nursi sees nationalism, okay, nationalism illegitimate. If a nation wants to rule itself, as long as it does it not at the cost of violating others' right, or doesn't do it in terms to dominate others, as it's only an attempt to have a self-governing system, which in this case, the self is the collective self, like Kurdish selves, then this is a positive one.
Kamal, I think, okay, I think I'm a little bit confused here. When you were talking about the constitutionalism, so inheritance is no longer considered the sole means of legitimacy. So what is the other like inherent?
No, inheritance is not the only condition or the sole condition of legitimacy. It was expected for someone like, let's say, people who were becoming the sultans in the Ottoman Empire, they would be from the Osman family. But just being from the Osman family wouldn't be sufficient. You would be a legitimate leader, which we are going to talk about how Said Nursi talks about it. If you were, okay, from this family, but you had to have other things, apply by the rules, abide by the rules, follow the rules. Even if the fact you were a king, at least theoretically, what you said wouldn't be the law of the land, just because it was pronounced by you. The law of the land was there, and you would be the ruler if you followed that law. So it's not the thing completely reversed. It's even if you could inherit the rule, it was conditional. This is probably the better way of describing it. Does it make sense?
So it's, even if you're a ruler, if you had inherited your the seat there, then I mean you're still considered a subject of the law and you must abide the law. Is that what?
Yes.
Okay.
Theoretically, but this theoretically is very important because it tells you a paradigm shift in the Muslim world. Before it wasn't the case. Following Imam al-Ja'ir or Fajr or Fasiq was something like this. So you could not, mostly in the Muslim world, theoretically, especially after, mostly in the 9th century, this thing was consolidated. Probably the biggest crime would be creating chaos. So order was the major issue. Even if you think some of the elements or the remnants of this kind of thought, you have been to Egypt when Mubarak was ousted, Ali Jum'ah, who was his mufti, he has a talk where he says, army has the right to kill anyone who attacks army's bases. Because based on the idea that there is this verse in the Quran, so master as much as power as you can for them. So the very attempt in the aggregating of the power, or wherever the power is aggregated, itself is a sacred thing. It cannot be dealt with. You cannot touch it. So this was the order, that when there is order established, anything that would cause disorder would be illegitimate, regardless whether the imam or the king were fajr or fasiq or whatever things they had. So
this has been used to support the legitimacy of even unjust rulers.
yes,
What's most important is order and stability.
Exactly. And even Americans, they still look for stability in the region, in the Middle East. So they have become Muslim. I'm joking. Anyways, so to come back to the issue of positive or musbat or negative manfi milliyetçilik. So manfi milliyetçilik would be a type of nationalism that would harm other people and their rights. For example, if you wanted to assimilate other groups, if you want to dominate other groups, if you try to prevent other groups from gaining their self-rule, this would be a manfi or negative nationalism. So for Nursi, nationalism was not something that essentially bad or essentially good. He qualifies it. It could be good, it could be bad. But certainly the positive nationalism is something that he believes, he calls juz'e haqqa, ya haqqe juz'iyya, something like this. The right that every nation has. So Yes. Oops. I'm trying to go to the next. Okay. So I talked about the impact of late 19th century and the clarity and ambiguity in the beliefs. So one of the things was, of course, the clarity is mostly in the, I'm talking about in the Kurdish politics, mostly discursive clarity existed. We are a different group, a different nation, a different ethnicity, and our right is there. But ambiguity is mostly in the politics, in the sense that because Sheikh Ubaidillah's revolt had this, or uprising had this positive impact in the sense that Kurds could easily talk about themselves as a nation. The fact that they were distinct nation, it was slowly becoming a kind of public consciousness among the Kurds. But the fact he was defeated, and there was an international opposition to it, it had created a sense that, so it was a question whether the Kurds alone, without others' help, whether they were able to gain the rights that they believed they had, whether they were able, for example, to create a state of their own without others' help. There were various things. Even the Sheikh Abdul Qadir, Sheikh Ubaidillah's son, who became the speaker of Turkish parliament, he believed that if they were able to, for instance, after the World War I, if they could convince the League of Nations, and if there be a support, the Leagues of Nations support for the Kurds would be able to create a state of their own. So this is the ambiguity that I'm trying. So certainly Nursi had a lot of other things that he would it supports this idea that Said Nursi was not only endorsing Kurdish rights, he was very much proud about his ethnicity. And many times he talks about how Kurds are free, and especially later when he becomes disillusioned and usually try to mock the common views about the Kurds when he refers to himself among people, say, I'm a Badawi Kurds, I'm a nomadic Kurds, or I'm a primitive Kurds, just to be bold and defiant. And he was a very defiant person.
And Kamal, I noticed that Sheikh Ubaidullah, by the time Said Nursi was a child, when Ubaidullah passed away.
In 1876.
Yeah, when Ubaidullah passed away. So in what extent did what Sheikh Ubaidullah, what he did and said, had an impact on this? Is there intellectual continuity, or?
Yes, it's a good question. So the thing, Sheikh Ubaidullah's influence was on the populace, on the Kurdish populace, on the Kurdish public, and of course, more so on madrasas, like these traditional Islamic schools, which this is probably mostly what existed in Kurdistan, not probably, certainly. And then on Sufi orders, which, because Naqshbandi was the most dominant one, And Nursi himself was a Naqshi or close to Naqshis or sympathetic to them. And then so we are talking about a huge uprising that takes place just when he was 5 years old. And even when you are 5 and you belong to a family that these things are talked about it and discussed and your surrounding, and especially one city was a place that Sheikh Ubaidullah was very much revered there because he was the one who saved one from Russians in the Russo-Ottoman War, and especially the Hassan Bey, the wali or the governor of one, was a murid pretty much, or the follower of Sheikh Ubaidullah. So Sheikh Ubaidullah was, even as I mentioned last time, Spear, this guy who writes the biography of this Cochrane, the famous missionary, it says Sheikh Ubaidullah was a third sacred figure in the Islamic world. So this is, whether it's an exaggeration or not, whether it's mostly in the Muslim, Middle East Muslim world, it could be, or we can discuss all the things. But the reality is, even for non-Kurds, when Dwight talks about him, he says he has about 2 million followers, talks about Sheikh Ubaidullah, and we are talking about 150 years ago. 2 million followers. And he says most of the pashas, means high-ranking officers, generals in Istanbul are his followers. So imagine a figure with such a stature and renown attempts at a revolution, and the revolution is essentially Kurdish and nationalist. Imagine the impact that it will leave. And actually, the thing, so I don't know whether I can find it. One of the biggest poets of the time, Kurdish poet of the time, that he wrote a poem about him that Wafai is now still a music. Actually, let me just play a little bit of it for you guys, that how I'm trying to forward it a bit. I'm not very technologically savvy. Anyway, so just to read a little bit, one couplet from it says,
that is a reading of a poem, or
a poem that was written about his exile, Sheikh Ubaidullah's exile, just to tell you how effective and how influential Sheikh Ubaidullah was. Both of you might understand this Surani Kurdish. It says, لباغان آهنا لنده دلن شايني وقلان روي لميخانان صداي شينده كوا بيري مغان روي دلن دوري قمر سيري فلك ميزاني قوراوا كوا قل زربو سنبل تكسو رنجي أرغوان روي. So if you, it says, in the gardens there is a supplication and cries that the head or the king of the kingdom of flowers left. in the Tavrans, again, as well, there is a cry and supplication because the head of the Magi is left. So, and then said, Dawri Qamar Sayri Falag Mizani Gorawa. Even the whole order of the universe has changed because, and the flowers have turned yellow and dry, and so it goes on. So we are talking about a very an enormous event that takes place. So it was as if almost like a prophetic figure in the region that attempts at an uprising, and so he's well known. And then what happened to it, the tragic and the sad ending. So it in many level affects the region. So for someone like Nursi, who was, as I said, certainly by any standards, who was the most influential Muslim scholar within Turkey, and of course he has influenced Muslims outside as well. It was only natural for him to know what was going on and to be affected and be influenced by the views of Sheikh Ubaidullah. So to come back to the again, you see other things that similar to what Sheikh Ubaidullah says, usually talks about religious sincerity of the Kurds. Sheikh Ubaidullah had also this kind of ethnic perspective about Kurdish religiosity. So he, even when he was tried in Istanbul by the what's called Uzal Harb Diwani, which is the special martial court, that he says, we are Kurds and we are not going to back for an ephemeral life. We can be deceived, but we don't deceive. So you see that how the ethnic character and the positive ethnic stereotypes come to the floor, come to the fore. And so usually this ethnic consciousness is very present in his writing, is his discussion with others, and he boasts about it. And he even says that Kurdish religious scholarship is also democratic, but he says constitutionalist, because for him the constitutionalism, as I said, is this culture that where people freely think and speak their minds. So, and he says the debates that takes place in the Kurdish madrasas, where people freely discuss their ideas. So he says Kurdish education is constitutionalist. I mean, again, I have to remind you this. I don't have much to say about the accuracy of these views. What is important for me is the self-perception. It's a very important factor in nationalism. So, and of course, he was very much concerned about Kurdish language. And as I said, even he's something that he was obsessed with. And until he died, it was a dream for him to create Zahra Institute, that we are now benefiting from its existence. And the Zahra Institute would be one of the institutions, probably the first institution that Kurdish language, in it, Kurdish language would be at least one of the 3 languages of instruction. And just to see the degree of the significance he attached to Kurdish language, I just want to read one excerpt from his writing. He says, one's degree of self-worth is based on one's devotion to one's mother tongue. And says, what is called the mother tongue, or lisani maderzaden, maderzad denilen, it's called mother, okay, is the mirror of dissemination of national sentiment, the weather of livelihood, abi hayat, and the tree grown out of the literary toil. The measurement of knowledge, ma'rifatin mizani, and the criterion of the collective level of self-worth and perfection, kamal. So I make my lamentation known to you for letting our language, which is a sign of civilization, become dry, deficient, sorry for the thing, and dysfunctional. So imagine this is said in 1912. And actually, it was in 2012 or 13. So it would be about 100 years later. A guy who was the interior minister, Buland Arinj, talked about the fact that Kurdish language is not the language of civilization. So it's very interesting to see how these things, Said Nursi, how perceptive he was and how he could understand or for him, the significance that mother language he had. So anyways, let's move on. While he has, okay, in 1907, he goes to Istanbul and talks to Abdul Hamid, and he asks, this is the first thing that he says, he has problem with the education with the state education, because the state's education system does not include Kurdish. So what he does, he asks for Kurdish language to be included in the education system, and Kurdish language become a language of instruction. One, because the value he thinks a mother tongue has, and the second, he thinks that education in another language for a poor Kurdish child is not beneficial. But what Abdul Hamid does in response, the Caliph of Islam just sends him to mental hospital. So not only they punish him in a way that he becomes completely discredited. To become completely discredited, not that happens. But the thing was just trying to say that if someone wants, this idea is just only a crazy person would have such an idea to talk about languages other than, and as I mentioned earlier, even here, I think in this chapter, I talked about the fact that Abdul Hamid believed Kurds are Muslims, and that's why they could be easily assimilated. It says that onlara bizim gibi yapmak zorundayız. So we have to Kurds make Kurds like us, to make Anatolia entirely Turkish. So this is the thing. While Abdul Hamid has these ideas, Said Nursi goes to Istanbul and talks about Kurdish language. But the Turkish historiography be it secular or religious, usually try to downplay the Nursi's nationalism, Kurdish nationalism. One of these guys, I think he's close to Haqqani House, close to Gulenist, these Nurju groups. He just makes up a lie. He just really fabricates it. He says, in effort to bring the natural sciences together with Islamic sciences, because he cannot just come to terms with the fact that Said Nursi, or he cannot say Said Nursi went there to ask for Kurdish language instruction. So, and the guy is teaching at Utah University. Imagine the degree of racism and fascism that, so he tries to completely, okay, someone is, let's see if there is anyone else want to join. Okay. So I'm sorry, something happened. Okay. He comes up with this lie that, okay, Said Nursi was trying to include Islamic sciences to the, it was called natural science and Islamic, whatever he wants to do. But the issue of Kurdish language is completely ignored. And Nursi visited Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1907 to seek his support for a university in Wan. So that university would be the Zahra Institute. However, the Sultan rejected the proposal to reconcile scientific reasoning with Islam. So Nursi becomes a religious zealot, and Abdul Hamid becomes a person who defends science. So this is how Turkish historiography tries to do things. But as I said, and in the previous thing, his major issue was the Kurdish language, and the institution was to include Kurdish language in the languages of instruction. There are certain things that, again, here you see resemblance of Sheikh Ubaidillah as well in Said Nursi's idea, especially last time we talked about the how triumphs and failures could be related to one's religious sincerity. If you have a religious faith or belief or sincere belief, it affects your worldly standings, and it affects whether, just the way Sheikh Ubaidillah believed, the Ottomans were defeated by the Russians because the Ottomans were no longer sincere Muslims. So you have similar views about that that Nursi repeats. I want to give you a what's called a break. I don't know, you want to take it now or a little later, or it's been an hour and 20 minutes that we are here. Guys, can I hear whether you want it now or later? Or we can just take another a 10-minute break and then come back. If it's okay with you guys.
That's fine.
You are fine with taking a break?
Yeah, I'm okay. Either way right now, I have my water with me. I got to eat my lunch.
Okay.
So
Very
it's okay for me both sides. So whether
Okay, then let's take a break.
maybe
Okay.
Yes.
take a
It
little
will
rest. Maybe.
refreshing a little bit for me because
Yeah, definitely.
You covered a lot in the 1 hour plus.
Yes. Very good. So see you soon then. Very good. One of the issues that probably could be the most interesting subjects in Nursi's pre-exile writing is the issue of caliphate. First of all, from Nursi's perspective, the entire history of caliphate post-Rashidun means after the death of Ali, he sees it as just the history of tyranny or tyrannical rules. So he has, as I mentioned, since the 9th century, especially with Al-Mawardi theoretization, the caliphate was tied to blood, or at least to lineage or tribal lineage. You had to be from Quraysh, or let's say Prophet's family, like Abbasids or others. So, and this, of course, created a challenge for the rise of Ottoman Caliphate in 16th century. When I talked about it, they came, when they conquered the Arab world, they had to declare themselves as caliphs and even claimed the title of the servants of the two shrines and all other things. For Arabs and most of the Muslim worlds, this this orthodox view about the relation between the caliphate and the blood lineage or blood ties was something very much prevalent and credible in most of the Muslim world, or let's say Middle East Arab Muslim world. I really don't know, because anyways, it is a history that I should not cause a lot of it would be a huge digression if I go into. But even after the demise of Baghdad, Khalajis in India and South Asia, they were claiming to be caliphs. So not long after the destruction of Baghdad. But anyways, let's leave this history because it will prevent us from dealing with the subject at hand. So there are a number of interesting things about the way Nursi talks about caliphate. First of all, Nursi defines caliphate as something, whether it's okay, it's the nature of the state that makes it caliphate or not. If the nature of the state is whether, and there was something like this, Ibn Taymiyyah had such a view as well. It's really the way the state conducts, or the state practice and the laws, or the way it follows the laws, determines whether it's the caliphate or the legitimate. So for Nursi, the caliphate is the legitimate state in the Muslim world. But, or at least when he reads history, but caliphate is whether it follows the path of, or the tradition of Prophet Muhammad. Okay. The way his historical reading is that post-Ali era in entire Muslim history is not a history of caliphate. These are all tyrannical rules, be they Abbasids, Ottomans, or whoever was in power. He sees them all as tyrannies or tyrannical rules. One. So And of course, he praises Kurds for disobeying Ottoman caliphs because he thinks that it was, the Kurds did a good thing, that they were stubborn, they were defiant against the Ottoman caliphs, because Ottoman caliphs were not legitimate rulers, at least from Nursi's perspective. And the other thing is that, so he has this thing that, so he tries to read history from the present's perspective, and at the same time he has this revisionist view that, okay, if a state is constitutionalist, is Shari'i. A Shari'i state is a constitutional state. So this is the thing. So meaning that a Shari'i state cannot be tyrannical, cannot be istibdadi, an autocrat or a tyrant cannot be legitimate anyways. So you can apply it to the history from Nursi's perspective. If there are tyrants, then their state was illegitimate. If they were not tyrants, it was their rule was so their rules was legitimate if they were not tyrant. Otherwise, it would be illegitimate. And the same is the case. So he goes and he says something else, which is again, talks about you see some similarities between what people like Al-Kawakibi would say in terms of how tyranny turns human beings into insignificant creatures, creatures without dignity. And he says, tyranny has poisoned the entire Muslim world. So I talked about the post-Rashidun thing. And he even has another thing when I assume that he must be an Ash'arite, the follower in theologically, the followers of Ash'ari school. But he thinks, for example, Mu'tazilite and Marji'ite or Qadaris, other groups, theological schools that they came to being because it was not, he doesn't say anything or doesn't mention Ash'aris. But anyways, he ties the existence or the emergence of the theological school to the tyranny in the Muslim world, mostly in the Abbasi and the Umayyad time. He believes if the state and the rule was just and freedom existed and people could express themselves, there would be these schools of theology would not have come to being. So the fact that these schools, that he sees them as astray and misled and misleading to the Muslims, existed is you have to blame what? Istibdad or tyranny. So this is
when you're talking here, Kamal, about the school of theology, are you talking about mazahib here or?
No, I'm talking about theological, Kalami school.
Theological, okay, so not that. Okay.
Kalami school is not mazahib, no. But all the schools, not all of them, at least he mentioned some of them. I don't know whether he has the same view about all or just the ones he mentions like Mu'tazilite and Marji'ite and others. He says they came to being because they were the outcome or the result of tyranny in the Muslim history. If Muslim history or Muslim rulers were not tyrannical, we would not have this kind of schools of theology. So, because he considered them as a kind of misleading schools or misled or whatever. So, and so from this comes the idea of, and he comes back to the issue. So again, we have constitutionalism as a political system and constitutionalism as a cultural, like a cultural tradition, let's say. So, as I said, the way, for example, a liberal today, a liberal person talks about democracy, this is how Nursi talks about constitutionalism, as not just as a form of governance, but also as a form of, as a type of culture. For example, when you can call someone Democrat, like someone who has democratic attitudes, behaviors, someone who is able to conduct a civil debate or something like this. So this is how, even by giving examples from Kurdish madrasas, this is how Said Nursi sees democracy, the constitutionalism, as this culture and system of freedom of expression, of also treating each other, human beings, with dignity, treating people as equal, and all these things. So that's why, and so the opposite of the constitutionalism would be tyranny. And he thinks that, first of all, the existing caliphs, or the caliphs that had existed up to his time, they are all, except for the Rashidun, they are all istibdadi or tyrannical. And then tyranny had a number of aspects. You see similar things in one way in Al-Kawakibi as well, when he says the tyranny and religion, the tyranny and politics, the tyranny and education, the tyranny and knowledge. So he divided his book based on these topics and how tyranny affects all these types of, all these arenas of human life, all these areas of human life. Here too, Nursi says, especially when it comes to the Kurdish situation, he says we have three types of tyrannies. One is political, which is related to the system of governing, the governing system, the political system, that's tyrannical. Then you have scholastic system, which has to do with the education. If the education does not allow for the freedom of expression, to free debate, for some free scholarship, free expression, and all these. Today, for instance, what we call it, not, of course, it doesn't have the same level of understanding of the situation, but today we are talking about academic freedom. Means research, means the way we, whether we are able to express our views, whether we are able to, for example, to speak truth to even the institutional power within the academic institution. These are all considered as academic freedom, or whether you are allowed by the state to speak in the class the way you want, or to do a research that, where the state does not put limits, especially for humanities and social sciences, where to do, okay, which topics are objectionable, which topics are okay to do things. So this is what we usually think of academic freedom. So in some ways, this is scholastic thing, the way he talks about the scholastic constitutionalism or tyranny, which is the opposite. So one aspect of the tyranny is the scholastic tyranny. And this is, he criticized, yes, at some point he defines, he defends scholarship in Kurdistan, but at the same time, he has problem with many of these scholars in Kurdistan because he finds them tyrannical, and they are unable to hear others, or they don't allow various ways of thinking about even religiosity, Islam. And for instance, the fact that he talks about these philosophical or Kalami schools, or when he talks about the post-Rashidin history. So whether you talk about theology or whether you talk about history, these are all could be areas that Muslim scholars might not easily accept different views. So Nursi takes issue with all this. And another thing that he talks about, which is very interesting, social or communal tyranny. From Nursi's perspective, tribalism or the existence of tribes or the fact that tribes can determine if person's views, thoughts, and especially these decisions and behaviors, these are all tyrannical. So, and this is what all these heavy hands of the past that affects people's lives today, or the way the community traditions have this kind of forceful impact. These are all considered tyranny, communal or social tyranny. And in order to so the path to liberation is constitutionalism from all these things. And so he, from there, when especially he focused more on the Kurdish situation, he talks about the fact that the path for repentance is constitutionalism. So if the Kurds want to be liberated, they have to adopt constitutionalism. We are not here we are not talking about the constitutionalism as a political system, mostly as a cultural system, or as a culture that would end all these aspects of tyranny. So that's why he thinks that Kurdish identity is like what's called these things of beads, and the court is all torn into pieces or very loosely tied to each other. And why? Because you have various manifestations of tyranny in within the Kurdish nation. So that's why it says when the idea of nationhood is shattered. So how it's shattered? When you have different packages or different groups that the overarching concern is not the nation, but local groups and local entities, then the nation loses its reality. So the reality of the nation is based on the way people feel about it, or what we call it the national sentiments. If you are a Kurd, let's say, probably Said Nursi would give an example like this. If you are a Kurd and you have an identity that is more important, for example, whether you are from that family or from that tribe or that group, that you're belonging to that group, to that entity, to that tribe is more important than belonging to the nation, then the nation has lost its reality. So in a way, I might be reading too much into it, but again, the imagination of the nation is based on what? How do we feel about it? But when the feeling doesn't exist and the bigger umbrella becomes invisible, then you have other umbrellas or other markers of identity. Then nationhood dissolves, it disappears. It's really based on how do you feel about it as a member. If the feeling about nationhood is not strong, then, And actually, he has another thing that he says, that every individual has to be the ma'kas, like the mirror of nationhood. Every individual has to kind of reflect, or in a way manifest, his belonging is his own individual life. So like you become a specimen of a nation, a sample, and he says nationalism, or what he calls hamiye milliya, national zeal, is a panacea to deal with the ill of tribalism. So it says, before nationalism,